Tempo in Commander. Does it exist, and how can we use it to our advantage? Let's talk about it. So there is kind of this sentiment and rule of thumb and thought process that tempo doesn't really exist in Commander due to the fact that it's a 3v1 in a lot of ways. Because it's a free-for-all format and there's 4 players, 1-for-1 removal, and any of these typical bounce spells that do work in tempo decks are not nearly as good as they would be in a 60-card constructed deck. In 60-card constructed, making sure that you have tempo advantage is simply being in the driver's seat compared to your opponent. A typical phrase is usually who is going to be the beatdown in a certain game. The beatdown is usually the one in the driver's seat, and they are in some ways forcing their opponents to respond, or they're making sure that their opponents can't have a response. And a typical tempo deck in 60-card formats typically looks like 1 to 2 threats, 4 copies of each of them, and then a bunch of interaction, removal, counter spells, and ways to protect those threats. The tempo deck doesn't need a ton of firepower, it just needs enough and to survive long enough to get its damage in. And it does this by proactively bouncing blockers to hit for damage. It does this by countering spells that might wipe the board or get rid of their creature. It might proactively counter some spells that don't do either of those things, but will make sure that their opponents are really tapped out so they can't do anything afterwards. Then on their turn, they're ensuring that they're drawing plenty of cards into more responses for their opponent's next turn. It's all about being in the driver's seat and having the most advantage on the board, with little to no firepower at some points. So today we're going to go over exactly how we can utilize tempo, what it even means for Commander, and yes, confirm that it does exist in the format, just in different ways and in a lot less of a capacity. So we pretty much established 3 different things that tempo decks want. They want threats on the board to push some damage, they want protection in order to protect these threats, and they want a lot of advantage to make sure that they actually are able to get more protection and get more firepower throughout the game. So a lot of that is going to have to deal with the deck building side of things, but first let's talk about the actual gameplay side of tempo. How do we make sure that we're maintaining tempo on our board state, and how do we make sure that even in a 4-player format, we can maintain tempo on our side of the board? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Instead of worrying about using your single target removal on every single person all the time, really we just need to make sure that we are being as selfish as possible with our life total and our resources. There's no need to bounce anything proactively, because if it's not coming at us, it actually isn't a threat and could honestly be considered a creature of our own. Yes, you could remove the monstrous 10/10 that is on the board, but if the 10/10 isn't swinging at you, why would you? That's 10 damage that can go towards somebody else, which is what we're going to need if we're going to have enough firepower to beat the rest of our opponents. Same goes for our opponent's Voltron deck. Why would we need to get rid of the Voltron commander unless it's coming our way? That is, I think, a big reason that most tempo decks seem to fail, or most pilots seem to fail, is that they are too happy removing things. Tempo, especially in Commander, needs to be as selfish as possible because you have so many threats and you only have really single target bounce and removal spells. Now let's go over the difference of bounce and removal spells really quick. Bounce is usually seen as not very powerful in Magic the Gathering and especially in Commander, but I promise you, it's pretty dang good. Like I said, if a 10/10 is on the battlefield, would you want to permanently remove it with an Infernal Grasp? Or would you want to just bounce it and delay it from coming at you? I'd rather have that 10/10 come at me, I bounce it with an unsummon, and then they either have 2 options. They can try to come at me again in 2 turns, in which case I'll probably be drawing 5 to 6 cards, or they can just choose to finally go at somebody else and deal 10 damage for us. I don't want to Infernal Grasp that because then that threat is gone for good, and that helps my other 2 opponents. Now, of course, bounce spells never permanently get rid of anything, and so when a Crater Hoof Behemoth hits the board, obviously you'll need something else for that, or you can hope that one of your mini counter spells is able to deal with it then. Or of course, sometimes you just don't got it. But that's Commander in general, and that has nothing to do with tempo. So I definitely prefer bounce over permanent removal when it comes to having a tempo style deck in Commander. This is typically because bounce is usually more mana efficient and is able to deal with threats that you need to deal with and not that you just want to deal with. The next way to really maintain tempo in Commander is by having very positive mana trades. If somebody's going to completely tap out for their commander, it probably is a good idea to either counter it or immediately bounce it after they're playing it. Countering a commander usually will get you targeted, but bouncing a commander most of the time doesn't really matter all that much. They can just recast it for 5. However, they have to then tap out once again to recast that commander. You really want to keep an eye on your opponent's lands when they cast a spell or they try to go all in some ways. Your opponents are going to shove. They're going to play that 10-10. They're going to play their commander. They're going to attach a bunch of stuff to their Voltron commander. This is when you have to see how much mana do they have up, how could they possibly interact with me, and are they going to come at me? And the last thing, of course, is making sure you have plenty of card advantage in your list. So when it comes down to maintaining tempo in a strategy like Commander, it's not about being super removal heavy, and it's not even about interacting all the time. It's about understanding when something actually is a threat to you and when to deal with it, and it's about being very, very selfish. No, you don't have to bounce that 10-10 creature unless it's coming at you. No, you don't have to bounce the Ristic Study unless it's drawing an obscene amount of cards. However, in which case, somebody else at the table might have already dealt with it. And then, of course, is keeping track of your opponent's mana. If they're going to completely tap out for something in the first main phase, it's probably a really good idea to then bounce it at the beginning of combat. They now just wasted and tapped out completely to play a creature that is now right back into their hand, essentially buying you a full turn, which is pretty great. So now that we've really gone over what tempo even looks like in Commander and how to really utilize it in a format that requires 4 players instead of just 2, we're now ready to go on to some of the deck lists that I've put together that showcase tempo in a very good way. And this list starts out with none other than Alela, Cunning Conqueror. This deck will be great at your bracket 2 and bracket 3 pods, where combat damage is usually the main win condition. But even if someone's playing a combo deck, you can hold up interaction because this deck has plenty of it, running exactly 40 instants. Now, that might seem like a lot, but when we get into the list, you'll see why this is. So Alela is a 2 generic Dimir commander that is a fairy warlock. It has flying and says, whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, create a 1/1 Black Fairy Rogue creature token with flying. Then, whenever one or more fairies you control deal combat damage to a player, you goad target creature that player controls. So this is asking us to do exactly what Tempo wants in Commander. It's telling us that we need to cast spells on our opponent's turns, and it rewards us for doing so. Then, it also allows us to truly utilize our other opponent's creatures in order to get that damage that we really need, forcing our opponents to really have to think if they want to deal with us. So how do we do this? Well, obviously 40 instants is quite a bit, and we make sure to split it up pretty evenly with draw and interaction, having more draw than interaction. While this deck does have a lot of ways to interact with the board, you want to make sure that you're being as sneaky as possible with it and as selfish as possible with it also. The deck runs a ton of bounce spells, a ton of full board bounces, and has 1 board wipe in Kindred Dominance. Due to the fact we have so many fairies, it's probably a good idea. The next thing you'll notice is that this deck also has a lot of cards that allow us to untap our lands. This is so we can cast the untap spell on one opponent's turn and have mana the next turn and even maybe the turn after that to cast other spells. The deck does a really, really good job at making sure you're making these 3 fairy tokens every single turn cycle. You're then able to utilize these flyers and their evasion in order to get into your opponent's boards and be able to goad their most valuable creature or their highest damage creature. The deck also runs cards like Deadly Dispute, Village Rites, and Corrupted Conviction in order to use these fairies to your best advantage. You don't need a ton of fairies, you just need at least 2 with your commander, and you can goad each of your opponents at least once, which is all you're limited to anyways. And then of course, some of our finishers end in stuff like Strixhaven Stadium, as well as just having some really good anthems for our fairies. Cards like Tegwill, Heraldic Banner, Patchwork Banner, Banner of Kinship, Adaptive Automaton, and Metallic Mimic all help make sure that our fairies are a little bit bigger than just 1/1s. Then you're able to chip every opponent for hopefully 2, 3, maybe even 4 damage with each of your fairies, goad the valuable creatures, be super restrictive with what you actually choose to remove, and only really worry about it when it's coming at you. And then by the time that they're able to actually get to you and break your defenses when the game really starts to stall out, your creatures are big enough to be able to win the game on their own. This deck is the epitome of blue-black. It's very tricky. It's very hard to deal with. You draw way more cards than the rest of your table, and overall, it's probably not a fun experience to play against, but that's not what we're here for. We're here to maintain tempo, baby. Now, the next deck we want to talk about is my Saruman the White Hand list. Now, I had a $10 version of this deck, and that will be linked below. Notably, it is not at $10 anymore because prices fluctuate, but I'll also make sure to have a more upgraded version that's also around $100, similar to Alela. Now, this deck is a bit more creative in how it likes to work. You're not going wide with your little creature tokens. Instead, you're going absolutely massive with these creature tokens. Almost the entire deck is built out of non-creature spells that are there to make sure that you can interact with the board, draw a ton of cards, and be able to utilize your orc for a ton of damage. Because of this, I think the deck originally is actually pretty well made and has never really not performed pretty well at tables. It's able to make sure that you're able to protect your threat, hit for a ton of damage, and even though you're running some pretty clunky high CMC cards, that's okay because they all become pump spells at the same time. Now this deck is just as tricky, utilizing a lot of counter spells to not only protect your orc, but also protect Saruman, who's making the orc super big. It's also able to stop these game-winning spells with the amount of counters it runs, and of course it's able to run a ton of card draw as well with the inclusions of blue and black. However, this deck is quite a bit more explosive because you have so much damage on your side of the board. Being able to give your orc fear or a rogue's passage, making it unblockable, or just having some way to give it trample or just fling it at your opponent is truly a great way to ensure that you're dealing a ton of damage at random points in the game. Cards like Fling are able to deal a ton of damage. Cards like Sandra's Ignition are going to deal a ton of damage. And of course, any ramp after the fact, or card draw after the fact, or removal, or anything that you play is going to be usually in the form of a non-creature spell that is going to be able to make your orc absolutely insane. This deck wants to go as tall as possible, but still maintain the same core fundamentals of any other tempo deck. Make sure to be very selfish with your interaction, make sure you're drawing a bunch of cards, and making sure when you are interacting, you're interacting at opportune times. I want to bounce things after my opponents completely tap out. I want to be able to interact after they've used all their resources and just set them back behind and make them have to restart the very next turn. Tempo is all about buying time for your board state to get to the point where it's going to be pretty lethal, and also make sure that your opponents get to the board states that they need so that they can hit your other opponents and hopefully not you. Tempo is definitely tricky in Commander, and it's not a perfect system the way that I'm talking about it right now, but for the most part, you can follow some of the very similar principles that other 60 card constructed tempo decks have. And if you play smart and understand what the board state is telling you, you can make sure that tempo is on your side. And with that being said, thank you guys all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys all next time.